All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 17, Section 5, the impact of expansion on Chinese immigrants and Hispanic citizens. So just like, immigrants in the East, a lot of immigrants came to the United States in the West, specifically from China, whereas New York was one of the main immigrant cities in the United States in the East. In the West, it was places like San Francisco. And so the experience of Chinese immigrants is pretty similar to that of other immigrant groups, except the geography is a little bit different here, again, speaking specifically in terms of the West. The Gold Rush was one of the first major wave of Chinese immigrants arrived in the United States. And much like everybody else who was going to California in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, these people from China hoped to strike it rich, much like everyone else. And also like everyone else, pretty much, didn't. It was very rare for anybody actually to become rich during the Gold Rush, but it didn't stop, tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000 people from going to California. And so a lot of those Chinese immigrants ended up working in different industries. One of the booming industries in the West was in the railroads. And so the Transcontinental Railroad in large part was built by Chinese workers. There were simply what you might call a lot of Chinese immigrants who ended up working in the railroad, or to say railroad workers. That was one of the main positions that was in demand. Many Chinese immigrants came to the U.S. using a credit ticket. That was someone else paid the ticket, and then you were in debt. You owed a debt. So the idea was that by using this ticket, you, as the Chinese immigrant, were essentially agreeing to pay back this debt, and oftentimes that could be whatever sort of job or labor that was provided for you, and you weren't quote unquote free until you'd actually paid off this debt. Most people who came to the United States from China were men, and so this is pretty much in line with the demographics of the West. Right, pretty much in line with the demographics of the West. And like other immigrant groups, found or faced discrimination. So for example, a lot of these Chinese workers were willing to work for a lower price than their white counterparts and therefore could undercut their wages. You had laws that were established in order to try and prevent this from occurring. So for example, there were specific or special taxes for Chinese only, whereas nobody else had to pay them. This was specifically on mining, for example. You also had Congress pass the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which limited and then later just completely cut off immigration from China. And, the Chinese Exclusion Act is very important for one reason, and that was this was the first time in American history that a group was targeted based on nationality in terms of immigration. Let's write that, immigration. It's a little bit misleading, right? So this was the very first law that sought to limit immigration for a specific national group, whereas before people were denied entry into the United States, but it was never because they were from somewhere. It was never because they were Chinese or they were Italian or they were Catholic. You could be denied entry into the United States if you were sick or had a disease or mentally ill, or maybe you didn't have enough money. This was the very first time that national origin. And so the Chinese became the first group to be explicitly excluded because of this. You also had various state laws, right? So it wasn't just Congress and the national government, but various state laws that just, discriminated against the Chinese. For Hispanics, and Hispanics just refers to Spanish speaking, they faced discrimination, but their circumstances were a little bit different. They weren't immigrants per se, but they were citizens, right? So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War, and that treaty extended citizenship to any former Mexicans who were now Americans, because that land, California, Arizona, New Mexico, that used to be Mexico, now it was the U.S. This treaty offered citizenship for those people who wanted to stay, and so they were granted citizenship. So there was no immigration process. Many of them were ranchers. They were called rancheros, or sometimes these people are referred to as Californios. They had land, but increasingly found pressure to retain it. And that was because in a lot of cases, when challenged, especially in something like a courtroom, many Anglos, Anglo refers to English speaking and Protestant, which many Hispanics were Spanish speakers and Catholics. The Anglos more or less controlled the courts. And a lot of these, former Mexican citizens, Spanish-speaking Catholics, found it very difficult to retain land, right? Difficult. And some just simply had it taken away from them. Some groups organized to fight back. Las Gorras Blancos, or the Whitecaps, organized to fight back and keep land, right? But like the Chinese, there were specific laws that were passed that particularly discriminated against Hispanics. So for example, Sunday laws, these were laws that more or less, these were laws that were inspired by Protestantism and targeted specific celebrations that occurred on Sunday. Sunday was considered to be like a holy day in Protestantism. Greaser laws also discriminated against Hispanics. So in both cases, and these could be state laws as well. So in both cases, you can see that in the case of the Chinese and in the case of Hispanics in California especially, laws specifically targeted those groups. In many cases, these communities lived in barrios, which were what we might call, say, Hispanic communities. And this was very much similar to the way that other ethnic cities were created. If we want to draw a comparison, you might say this might be like the Chinatown that you had in places like San Francisco and Los Angeles and other areas. And this was more or less true for a lot of immigrant groups, although most Hispanics weren't immigrants at this time. But that was to create specific ethnic communities that could help preserve things like culture, religion, language, etc., etc.